The Giannis situation in Milwaukee has taken yet another dramatic turn. As the Bucks have now lost 7 games in a row, Giannis is openly and publicly talking about how frustrated he is, which of course is very, very concerning if you're a Bucks fan. Now, the beginning of the year for the Bucks actually didn't start all that poorly. They had a pretty good start to the year. Guys were making shots. The team kind of made sense. You had this rising backcourt player in Ryan Rollins. AJ Green was playing really well. They had a bunch of shooters, guys like Gary Trent, and Miles Turner has been solid for them. He's been good on defense. He's been a solid fit alongside of Giannis in the front court because of his ability to space the floor. And in the beginning of the year, you could squint and start to see Milwaukee as like a top 4, top 5 team in the East in the regular season. Then once you get into the postseason, you've got Giannis and anything could happen. And it really started to seem like the Bucks, even though it was a risky move, some of the stuff they did in the offseason, it was probably going to be enough to keep Giannis happy and keep him around. Because the number one thing that we know about Giannis is, yes, he is loyal to the Bucks, but that loyalty only extends as far as the Bucks are winning. Giannis's loyalty to the Bucks is not above his loyalty to winning and trying to compete for championships. And the beginning of the season looked like a team that could at least kind of toe that line of just good enough to keep Giannis around. The problem was Giannis got hurt. So they're on a 7-game losing streak as of this recording. Giannis has only played one of those games. He got hurt. And anytime you have a star player that's already maybe a little bit frustrated by the roster that's been put around him, maybe has thought about going elsewhere, and then that guy gets hurt and the team immediately craters, obviously the concern level is going to grow. Now, granted, nobody expects the Bucks to be good when Giannis doesn't play. The entire team is built around him. All of the other complimentary quote-unquote stars are now gone. There's no Chris Middleton. There's no Damian Lillard. There's no Drew Holiday. The second best player on the team is probably Miles Turner, unless you really like Kyle Kuzma, maybe Ryan Rollins. That's where we're at in the roster hierarchy. But it still really illustrates how big of a gap there is with Milwaukee's roster around their superstar and pretty much every single other superstar in the league, which again, just gets the wheels turning a little bit for Giannis in potentially looking elsewhere. We know we've gotten reports and rumors that in the offseason there was at least some conversations had about Giannis possibly going to the Knicks, but they weren't really able to come up with a deal there. And so the combination of all of these things, possible rumors around Giannis in the offseason the last couple of years, team not being that good, Giannis saying outwardly that he's frustrated, saying publicly that he's frustrated by the losing, does cause a level of concern for me if I was a Bucks fan. And all of this obviously leads back to their decision to waive and stretch Damian Lillard and then sign Miles Turner, because the theory behind that move was long-term, it's not a good decision to pay all of this money for Dame to go away just to bring in Miles Turner, who's not someone that's necessarily going to raise your ceiling a ton. But in the short term, the theory was it would be enough to keep Giannis around and happy, compete for potentially a top 5 seed in the Eastern Conference. And as I said earlier, in the beginning of the season, that looked like that might be the case. But in a scenario that we might be heading towards now, where Giannis may not be on the team, it gets extremely dangerous, because all of a sudden you're paying Miles Turner on a team that's not very good, on a contract that other teams are not going to want to trade for, and you have all of this cap space that's being used up for years and years and years on Damian Lillard, who's not even on the team, and you did all of that just to keep Giannis, just for Giannis to, in this case, potentially leave. However, if you are a Bucks fan, there's a couple of things that could potentially save the situation here. First and foremost, it is unbelievably difficult to trade for a player of Giannis's caliber in the middle of the season for a variety of reasons. One, you have less cap flexibility in the middle of the year than you do in the offseason because you have all of your contracts. In the offseason, you might have cap space. You might have other teams that have cap space. It gets easier to facilitate where salaries are going to go, which I think would obviously be a big part of this. It becomes easier to do a giant multi-team trade in the offseason because you have that flexibility. One of the other issues with a giant midseason trade here would be having to integrate a player like Giannis in the middle of the season. Teams like San Antonio, teams like Houston, for example, would have to trade away 4 pieces of their rotation just to get the money to work. And at that point, yeah, bringing in Giannis is obviously a great thing, but you're bringing in Giannis to compete. You're bringing in Giannis to be good. That's one of the reasons, probably the only reason that he's frustrated with Milwaukee is winning. And if you can't win when bringing in Giannis because you're trying to integrate him in the middle of the year, it becomes incredibly risky. And for a guy that would be a free agent in the summer 2027, if he chooses to do so by declining his player option, and you would have to make sure that you sign him to an extension to possibly avoid that, which means he needs to be happy immediately, which is very difficult to do by trading for a guy midseason and completely shaking up your roster. And the last point, and arguably the most important point here, is it would be incredibly difficult and risky for Giannis to request a trade in the middle of the season, because that submarines the entire year for Milwaukee. Everything changes with the Bucks. And for a guy that's been so loyal to them over the years, doing that in the middle of the year would just be unbelievably risky. And I think the only way in which the Bucks actually trade Giannis is if he asks, if he goes to the team and says, I've been loyal, I've been happy, I am no longer happy, the team just is not good enough. That's the only scenario which I see it happening. And as I said, mid-season, that would be incredibly difficult. If it did happen, I think the two teams to keep an eye on would be Houston and San Antonio, as I mentioned. One of the main reasons is I just find it hard to believe that the Bucks would trade Giannis in the conference in the East. I know there was some mentions of possibly the Knicks being involved in the offseason like we talked about earlier, but I find that extremely unlikely. And Houston and San Antonio both have the ability to actually make a deal work, whether it be in the middle of the season or in the offseason. They both have contracts, they both have picks, and they have a team that, if you add Giannis to it, certainly would compete for the title this season. Obviously, you'd have to deal with integrating a player like Giannis in the middle of the year, which I talked about earlier, but even Houston and San Antonio are not perfect matches in this scenario either. The Rockets would have to give up a bunch of stuff for a team that already looks like it has an outside chance of competing at the top of the West, and the Spurs would probably have to give up someone like De'Aaron Fox, who seemed kind of like a luxury for a while, but now seems really, really consequential, and if it's not him, you'd have to give up some of these young guys. And I think San Antonio would probably look at the situation and say, yeah, Giannis and Wemby together sounds awesome, but you know what else sounds awesome? Dylan Harper, Steph Castle, De'Aaron Fox, and Wemby all together, rather than consolidating that into one guy that may just want to leave in 2027. That's obviously a lot of risk. I think it makes more sense for Houston because I think their timeline is a little bit more in an immediate term here, because obviously they have Kevin Durant. I would be very, very hesitant, obviously, to trade like Amen Thompson or Şengün, even for a player as great as Giannis, which probably would just take them out of the running completely. Not to mention the fact, I think this is something that is definitely going to be hovering over any potential win now moves in the Western Conference specifically. The Oklahoma City Thunder are the bar. They're the reigning champs. As of this recording, they are 19-1. And so if you are making this kind of a move in the middle of the year, trading for Giannis, you have to be confident that it gives you a chance to beat the Thunder this year, next year, the year after. And I'm not sure that that's the case for any of these teams. Even if Houston adds Giannis, even if San Antonio adds Giannis, I'm not sure you can reach the bar consistently. And if you are trading all of this stuff in exchange for Giannis, upending your team in the middle of the season the way that you would have to if you're trading for Giannis, and all of that means you still don't have the best chance in the Western Conference of making the finals, to me, even though Giannis is great, that feels like too big of a risk. So the long story short here for Giannis is this. Clearly, he is frustrated with the lack of team success this season. I think he realizes the team around him is not very good. And if he was to request a trade in the middle of the season, obviously the Bucks would be forced to consider that. However, the likelihood of a team actually making a move in the middle of the year for Giannis is unlikely, because it is difficult to do cap space wise, and you'd be upending potentially a contender and trading away a bunch of rotation pieces to integrate a massive piece in Giannis in the middle of the season. So I think the most likely scenario here is the Bucks tough it out throughout the year. They're going to be okay. They're probably going to win like 42 games. Then we go into the offseason, and that is really the pivot point for the Giannis situation overall in Milwaukee. They're going to offer him an extension. He's probably not going to sign it. He's going to be looking at potentially being a free agent in the summer of 2027, which once we get to the offseason would be basically a year from then. And at that point, two things can happen. One, the Bucks can decide they are better off, the future of the franchise is better off, they trade Giannis for a bunch of stuff, or Giannis can go to the team and say, hey, I no longer want to be here. I want to go out and look at other opportunities. I'm not going to sign the extension. If you don't trade me now, I'm probably going to leave in the summer of 2027. So even though it's interesting that Giannis is frustrated and the team isn't particularly good, logistically, I find it unlikely and pretty difficult to find a scenario in which Giannis actually gets traded in the middle of the season.